The steel fish sliced through the water like destiny itself, its wake a thin white line cutting toward the massive Japanese tanker. After 3 years of cursing dud torpedoes, broken detonators, and weapons that ran too deep or exploded too early, Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison watched his Mark 14 torpedo run true and straight. This time would be different. This time, the fish would bite. The explosion that followed lit up the Luzon Strait like a second sunrise. My name is Jake Morrison, and I commanded Torpedo Squadron 18 aboard the USS Hornet in the autumn of 1944. By then, I'd been flying combat missions in the Pacific for 2.5 years, and I'd seen more good men die because of faulty torpedoes than I cared to remember. But that October morning, as we approached a Japanese convoy carrying fuel to their dying empire, everything changed. We finally had a weapon that worked. The story of that day begins months earlier, back in Pearl Harbor, where our squadron was resting between deployments. The war had been grinding on for 3 years, and we torpedo pilots had earned a reputation as the unluckiest bastards in the Navy. While dive bomber and fighter pilots racked up kills, we struggled with the Mark 14 torpedo, a weapon so fundamentally flawed that it had become a bitter joke among aircrew. I remember the morning in August when Commander Bill Roberts, our squadron leader, called us into the briefing room. His weathered face looked different somehow, hopeful, maybe even excited. Roberts had been flying torpedo bombers since before Pearl Harbor, and optimism wasn't his usual expression. "Gentlemen," he said, gesturing to a torpedo mounted on a display rack, "meet the new Mark 14. The Bureau of Ordnance has finally fixed the thing." We'd heard this before. The Mark 14 had been fixed multiple times since 1942, each update promising to solve the problems that plagued this weapon. The torpedo ran too deep, missing targets entirely. Its magnetic detonator exploded prematurely or not at all. The contact detonator was so sensitive it would detonate on hitting the water, or so insensitive it would bounce off enemy hulls like a rubber ball. Ensign Tommy Chen, our youngest pilot, raised his hand. "Sir, what's different this time?" Robert smiled, actually smiled. "This time they listened to us. The depth control has been completely redesigned. The magnetic detonator has been removed entirely, and the contact detonator has been rebuilt from the ground up. Boys, we finally have a torpedo that will explode when it hits the target." The room erupted in cheers, but I remained skeptical. I'd lost too many friends to defective torpedoes to get excited about another promised fix. My mind drifted to Lieutenant Pete Kowalski, shot down over Rabaul in 1943 after his torpedo ran under a Japanese destroyer without exploding. Pete had made a perfect attack run, dropped his fish at the ideal angle and distance, and watched it pass harmlessly beneath his target. The destroyer's anti-aircraft guns had torn his Avenger apart on his second pass. "Morrison," Roberts called out, snapping me back to the present. "You'll be leading the first test flight tomorrow. Take Chen and Martinez with you. We'll see if this fish really has teeth." The next morning, I climbed into the cockpit of my TBF Avenger, a sturdy aircraft that had carried me through dozens of combat missions. The Avenger was a big, reliable plane, capable of carrying a 2,000-pound torpedo or an equivalent bomb load. Its 3-man crew, pilot, radioman, gunner, and turret gunner, had proven effective in the brutal air battles of the Pacific. My radioman, Chief Petty Officer Sam Rodriguez, had been with me since the beginning. A veteran of the Guadalcanal campaign, Rodriguez had survived more combat missions than most pilots. He settled into his position behind me, checking his radio equipment and preparing for our test flight. "Ready when you are, Skipper," Rodriguez said over the intercom. His voice carried the calm professionalism that had kept us alive through countless combat missions. Our target was a decommissioned destroyer anchored in the test range off Kahula Island. I'd attacked similar targets before with the old Mark 14s, watching in frustration as our torpedoes either missed completely or failed to detonate. This time felt different, though I couldn't say why. The test flight went perfectly. My torpedo at the correct depth struck the target amidships and exploded with devastating effect. The old destroyer broke apart and sank within minutes. Chen and Martinez achieved similar results, their torpedoes performing exactly as designed. For the first time in 3 years, we had a weapon that worked. Our opportunity to use the improved Mark 14 in combat came sooner than expected. In October 1944, Admiral Halsey launched a series of carrier strikes against Japanese shipping lanes in the South China Sea. Intelligence reported a large convoy moving through the Luzon Strait, carrying aviation fuel desperately needed by Japanese forces in the Philippines. The convoy consisted of 6 tankers escorted by 4 destroyers and a light cruiser. It was exactly the kind of target that torpedo bombers were designed to attack: large, valuable ships moving in formation, protected by anti-aircraft fire and fighter cover. I remember the pre-mission briefing aboard the Hornet. Commander Roberts stood before a large map of the Luzon Strait, pointing to our target's projected position. The convoy was moving northwest, trying to reach Japanese-held ports in Formosa before American forces could intercept them. "Gentlemen," Roberts said, "this is what we've been waiting for. 6 tankers loaded with aviation fuel. If we can sink these ships, we'll cripple Japan's air operations in the Philippines." The plan was straightforward. Our 12 Avengers would approach the convoy from the southwest, using cloud cover to mask our approach. Fighter escorts would engage the Japanese combat air patrol while we made our torpedo runs. Each aircraft would carry a single Mark 14 torpedo, the weapon we'd finally learned to trust. I studied the convoy's formation, noting the positions of the escort vessels. The tankers sailed in 2 columns, with destroyers positioned on the flanks and forward. The light cruiser brought up the rear, its heavy anti-aircraft armament providing additional protection. "What about fighter opposition?" asked Lieutenant Bill Harper, one of our most experienced pilots. "Expect at least a dozen Zeros," Roberts replied. "Maybe more. The Japanese know how valuable this convoy is. They'll fight hard to protect it." As we prepared for the mission, I felt the familiar mixture of excitement and dread that preceded every combat flight. The improved Mark 14 gave us a real chance of success, but attacking a heavily defended convoy was never easy. Japanese escort commanders were skilled and aggressive, and their anti-aircraft gunners were deadly accurate. My plane captain, aviation machinist Mate First Class Tony Ricci, performed his final pre-flight inspection with characteristic thoroughness. Ricci had been maintaining Navy aircraft since before the war, and his meticulous attention to detail had saved my life more than once. "She's ready, Mr. Morrison," Ricci said, patting the Avenger's engine cowling. "Fresh oil, full fuel, and 1 brand new Mark 14 torpedo. This fish is going to bite." The torpedo nestled in the Avenger's belly looked identical to the weapons we'd been carrying for 3 years, but the internal modifications made all the difference. The new depth control mechanism would keep it running at exactly 18 feet below the surface. The redesigned contact detonator would explode on impact, not before or after. After years of frustration, we finally had a weapon worthy of our sacrifice. Rodriguez climbed into his position behind me, checking his radio equipment one final time. Our tail gunner, aviation radioman second class Eddie Kowalski, Pete's younger brother, settled into the rear turret. Eddie had requested assignment to my crew after his brother's death, and I'd been honored to have him aboard. "All systems check out, Skipper," Rodriguez reported. "Ready for takeoff." The Hornet turned into the wind, her flight deck busy with the controlled chaos of launch operations. 12 Avengers sat on the deck, their engines warming up, torpedoes secured beneath their bellies. Our fighter escort, 16 F-6F Hellcats, would launch first, followed by our torpedo bombers. At 0800 hours, the launch flag dropped. The first Hellcat roared down the deck and into the sky, followed by the rest of the fighter squadron. Then it was our turn. I advanced the throttle, feeling the Avenger's engine respond with smooth power. The big radial engine had carried us through countless missions, and I trusted it completely. The deck crew pulled the wheel chocks, and we rolled forward towed catapult position. The catapult officer raised his flag, looked back at me, and I nodded. The flag came down, and the catapult hurled us into the morning sky. Within minutes, our entire formation was airborne, heading northwest toward the Luzon Strait. The flight to the target took 2 hours, during which we maintained strict radio silence. The Japanese had effective radio monitoring capabilities, and any transmission might compromise our mission. We flew at low altitude, using scattered clouds to mask our approach. As we neared the target area, I spotted the convoy on the horizon. 6 large tankers steamed in formation, the vessels positioned defensively around them. Smoke rose from their stacks, indicating they were making maximum speed toward their destination. "Target in sight," I transmitted to the squadron. "Form up for attack." The convoy commander had positioned his ships well. The tankers sailed in 2 columns, with destroyers on the flanks and forward. The light cruiser guarded the rear, its heavy anti-aircraft armament covering the convoy's most vulnerable approach route. Our fighter escort engaged the Japanese combat air patrol, drawing the Zeros away from the convoy. The sky filled with the distinctive sound of aerial combat, machine guns chattering, engines roaring, men shouting over the radio. "Red leader to all torpedo bombers," came the fighter squadron commander's voice. "We've got them occupied. Make your runs now." I led the 1st Division toward the nearest tanker, a massive vessel that had to be carrying at least 10,000 tons of aviation fuel. The ship's anti-aircraft guns opened fire as we approached, filling the sky with deadly black puffs of smoke. The key to a successful torpedo attack was timing and positioning. We had to approach at exactly the right angle and altitude, drop our torpedoes at the correct distance, and escape before the enemy's defensive fire could destroy us. The old Mark 14s had made this difficult because their unreliability forced us to make multiple attacks, exposing us to increasing danger. But now we had a weapon that worked. I brought my Avenger down to 50 feet above the water, adjusting my approach angle to give the torpedo the best chance of hitting the target. The tanker loomed larger as we closed the distance, its anti-aircraft guns tracking our movement. "Steady, skipper," Rodriguez called over the intercom. "Looking good." The tanker's gunners found our range, and explosive shells burst around us. I felt the Avenger shudder as shrapnel peppered the wings, but the sturdy aircraft held together. At 1,000 yards from the target, I pressed the torpedo release button. The Mark 14 dropped cleanly from the aircraft, hit the water with a splash, and began its run toward the target. Unlike the old torpedoes, this one ran straight and true, its wake clearly visible in the blue water. "Fish is running hot and normal," Rodriguez reported, watching the torpedo's progress. I pulled up and turned away from the target, climbing to avoid the anti-aircraft fire. Behind me, the torpedo closed the distance to the tanker, its wake pointing directly at the ship's engine room. The explosion was everything we'd hoped for. The Mark 14 struck the tanker amidships and detonated with devastating effect. The ship's hull split open, and aviation fuel ignited in a massive fireball that rose hundreds of feet into the air. "Direct hit," Rodriguez shouted over the intercom. "She's going down." The tanker settled by the stern, its cargo of aviation fuel feeding the flames that consumed the ship. Within minutes, the vessel had disappeared beneath the waves, taking 10,000 tons of desperately needed fuel with it. Other members of our squadron were achieving similar results. Lieutenant Harper's torpedo struck a second tanker, causing another spectacular explosion. Ensign Chen's fish hit a third tanker, and the ship began listing heavily to port. But the Japanese weren't giving up without a fight. The escort destroyers moved to intercept our remaining aircraft, their anti-aircraft guns creating a deadly barrage. The light cruiser's heavy guns joined the defense, filling the sky with explosive shells. Lieutenant Martinez was hit during his attack run, his Avenger catching fire as he approached his target. I watched him drop his torpedo anyway, scoring a direct hit on another tanker before his burning aircraft crashed into the sea. "Martinez is down," I reported over the radio. "Continue the attack." The battle raged for 30 minutes, our torpedo bombers pressing their attacks, while Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns fought to protect the convoy. The sky filled with smoke, fire, and the debris of aerial combat. When the shooting stopped, 5 of the 6 tankers had been sunk or heavily damaged. The 6th ship, its cargo holds flooded and engines dead, lay dead in the water. The convoy that had carried enough aviation fuel to support Japanese air operations for months had been destroyed. But victory came at a price. We'd lost 4 aircraft and 12 men, including Lieutenant Martinez and his crew. The cost of aerial warfare in the Pacific was always high, even when our weapons worked properly. As we formed up for the return flight to the Hornet, I looked back at the burning oil slick that marked the convoy's grave. Thousands of tons of aviation fuel, fuel that would have powered Japanese fighters and bombers, now burned uselessly on the ocean's surface. "Good work, boys," Commander Roberts transmitted to the squadron. "The fish bit hard today." The flight back to the carrier gave me time to reflect on what we'd accomplished. For 3 years, American torpedo bombers had struggled with defective weapons, losing countless aircraft and crews-to-equipment failures. The Mark 14 torpedo had been her greatest frustration, a weapon that promised so much but delivered so little. Now, finally, we had a torpedo that worked. The improved Mark 14 ran at the correct depth, struck its targets, and exploded with devastating effect. In a single mission, we demonstrated what torpedo bombers could accomplish when properly equipped. The Hornet appeared on the horizon, her deck crew preparing for our return. Landing aboard an aircraft carrier after a combat mission was always a relief, but this time felt different. We'd finally proven that American torpedo bombers could be as effective as their dive bombing and fighter counterparts. As my Avenger caught the arresting wire and jerked to a stop, I felt a sense of satisfaction that had been missing from previous missions. The Mark 14 torpedo had finally become the weapon it was designed to be, and we'd used it to strike a devastating blow against Japanese shipping. Tony Ricci met me at the aircraft, his weathered face showing the strain of waiting for our return. "How'd the fish work, Mr. Morrison?" "Perfect," I told him. "Absolutely perfect." Rodriguez climbed down from his position, removing his helmet and flight gear. "5 tankers," he said, shaking his head in amazement. 5 tankers in 30 minutes. The old Mark 14s never could have done that. Eddie Kowalski emerged from the tail turret, his young face grim. "Martinez didn't make it back," he said quietly. "Good pilot. He got his torpedo on target even with his plane on fire." I nodded, feeling the familiar weight of loss that accompanied every mission. The improved Mark 14 had given us the capability to strike effectively at Japanese shipping, but it couldn't bring back the men we'd lost along the way. The debriefing that followed confirmed what we'd observed during the battle. 5 tankers sunk, 1 heavily damaged, and approximately 50,000 tons of aviation fuel destroyed. The cost to Japanese air operations in the Philippines would be severe, potentially crippling their ability to defend against MacArthur's upcoming invasion. "This is what we've been waiting for," Commander Roberts said during the debriefing. "A weapon that actually works." The Mark 14 performed exactly as designed, and you boys made the most of it. Intelligence reports received over the following days confirmed the mission's success. The destruction of the tanker convoy had forced Japanese commanders to ration aviation fuel, reducing the number of combat sorties they could fly. American forces landing in the Philippines would face significantly reduced air opposition. The psychological impact was equally important. For 3 years, Japanese convoy commanders had grown accustomed to surviving American torpedo attacks. Many of our weapons had been duds, running under targets or failing to explode. The sudden effectiveness of our torpedo bombers came as a shock to enemy forces. Captain John McCain, the Hornet's commanding officer, visited our squadron the day after the mission. McCain, whose son would one day become a senator, had been following the Mark 14's troubled development with particular interest. "Gentlemen," McCain said, addressing our assembled pilots, "yesterday's mission represents a turning point in this war. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, our torpedo bombers have achieved their full potential. The Japanese will no longer be able to ignore the threat you represent." Over the following weeks, our squadron participated in several more missions against Japanese shipping. Each time, the Mark 14 torpedoes performed flawlessly, sinking tankers, transports, and warships with devastating effectiveness. The improved torpedoes' success extended beyond our single squadron. Throughout the Pacific Fleet, torpedo bomber crews reported similar results. The weapon that had been our greatest frustration had become our most effective tool against Japanese shipping. By November 1944, Japanese merchant shipping losses had reached catastrophic levels. The combination of submarine warfare, air attacks, and mining operations had reduced Japan's merchant fleet to a fraction of its pre-war size. The Mark 14 torpedo, in its finely perfected form, played a crucial role in this campaign. I flew my last combat mission in December 1944, as American forces consolidated their hold on the Philippines. By then, Japanese shipping in the region had been reduced to occasional lone vessels, heavily escorted and sailing only at night. The Mark 14 torpedo had finally become the weapon its designers had envisioned. After 3 years of failures, modifications, and bitter frustration, American torpedo bombers could attack enemy shipping with confidence in their weapons. But the cost of reaching this point had been enormous. Hundreds of aircraft had been lost, thousands of aircrew killed or wounded, all because of a torpedo that didn't work properly. The men who died in 1942 and 1943 had been just as brave as those who survived to see the Mark 14's eventual success. As I prepared to rotate back to the United States, I thought about the lessons learned during those long years of combat. The importance of effective weapons cannot be overstated. Courage and skill alone are not enough. Warriors need tools that work when lives depend on them. The Mark 14 torpedo's story represents both the worst and best of American military technology. The initial failures cost thousands of lives and prolonged the war. But the eventual success of the weapon helped shorten the conflict and save countless lives on both sides. Today, as I look back on those years of combat in the Pacific, I remember the moment when our improved Mark 14 torpedo struck that first tanker in the Luzon Strait. The explosion that followed wasn't just the destruction of an enemy ship. It was the vindication of 3 years of sacrifice and the promise of victory to come. The steelfish had finally learned to bite, and Japan's empire would never recover from the wounds we inflicted. In the end, American ingenuity and determination had triumphed over both technical challenges and enemy resistance. The Mark 14 torpedo had become the perfect weapon, and we had used it to help win the war.